Space, a brand new chart for the head and for the heart. It's your journey, your tools.
Everyone experiences profound loss. It is, arguably the most universal human experience there is, cutting across absolutely everything: culture, age, background.
It really is. Yet, when we try to talk about it, just in daily life, the language we have, the sort of mental models society offers, they often fall drastically short, don't they?
They really do. It leaves so many people feeling intensely confused or profoundly isolated.
Yeah, and it's often not because their internal reaction is abnormal in any way. It's more because they're trying to shoehorn this vast, complex, messy reality of their experience into these, well, frankly, outdated or simply inaccurate social expectations.
Like being handed a rigid timeline or a script that just doesn't match the actual, waves of emotion they're feeling.
Exactly. It creates this huge disconnect. You've got this whole body experience happening inside this internal storm we call grief. But the common social narrative, it just doesn't validate the sheer scale of what you're actually going through.
Right. So today we are undertaking a deep dive into the complex landscape of human grief. We want to move beyond those really popular misconceptions like the 5 stages idea.
So definitely.
And explore what modern psychology and thanatology, that's the study of death and dying, what they actually tell us.
And our sources for this deep dive, they're pretty comprehensive. They span decades of clinical analyses, different theoretical models, and also critical evaluations of how we actually process these profound life changes. We're really aiming for precision here.
Yeah, our mission really is to take these nuanced sources and provide you, our listener, with a clear, nuanced, and hopefully a truly compassionate framework for understanding loss.
Whether you're grappling with a significant loss yourself right now, or maybe you're trying to stand beside someone else, trying to support them through theirs.
Exactly. We want to equip you with the precise language and the concepts you need to navigate this universal experience with hopefully greater clarity and compassion.
Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this. And maybe the best place to start is with the fundamental vocabulary, because just defining the terms we often throw around interchangeably, that seems key to getting a genuinely nuanced analysis.
Absolutely. When we talk about loss, we tend to use words like grief, bereavement, and mourning, almost as synonyms.
Right. You hear them all used together.
You do. But in clinical work, in theoretical analysis, they actually describe 3 distinct, though definitely interconnected, phenomena. And understanding the differences, well, it's crucial for effective diagnosis, for support, for just understanding.
Okay, so let's start with the internal experience. That's grief.
That's grief. Our sources define grief as the natural, emotional, psychological, and even physiological response to a significant loss.
So it's the whole constellation of internal reactions,
Right.
The deep sadness, maybe confusion, the physical aches, even that sheer mental exhaustion.
Exactly. All of that internal turmoil. And the scope of grief is, well, it's immensely broad. Well, we obviously link it intrinsically to death. It's triggered by any significant absence. We see it just as intensely, often, in response to divorce, or maybe the diagnosis of a serious life-altering illness.
Like losing your health, in a way.
Precisely. Or losing a major job, that career identity that defined you, or even the dissolution of a really important defining relationship.
So the intensity is kind of proportional to how central that loss feels to your life structure.
That's a great way to put it. The core truth here is how significant, how central that loss feels. And the core insight, this is really vital to stress, is that grief is not a pathology. It's not a weakness.
Right. It's not something to be, like, cured or overcome, like an illness.
Not at all. It's a normal, it's an adaptive, and it's a fundamentally human emotional process. It's rooted in the depth of our attachments. When you grieve, it's actually proof that you cared deeply, that something mattered.
And it's rarely linear, is it? People always talk about the roller coaster.
The roller coaster, or maybe more accurately, like waves, where the intensity might recede for a bit, you feel like you're doing okay, and then bam, it can reappear with full force days, months, even years later. It's not a straight path.
Okay, so that's the internal grief. What about bereavement?
So moving from that internal experience, bereavement defines the objective state. It's the state of having experienced a loss, particularly, though not exclusively, through death.
So if someone is bereaved, they're in that period or status where the grief is happening.
Exactly. It defines the external reality. You are now perhaps a widower or an orphan or someone who has lost a limb or a home. It's the fact of the loss having occurred.
And the duration of that state, that period, that's highly variable.
Hugely variable. It's shaped by all sorts of circumstantial factors, the relationship you had, the social support available or maybe a lack thereof, and also highly personal factors, your own coping style, your prior life experiences with loss.
Okay, so grief is internal, bereavement is the state of loss. Which brings us to mourning.
Right. And if grief is the internal anguish, mourning is its external expression. It's the public, the observable side. It's the process by which individuals and often communities adapt to the loss. And crucially, it's often guided by established customs.
Ah, so this is where culture really steps in.
Absolutely. The form mourning takes is profoundly shaped by cultural norms, religious traditions, social expectations. Mourning provides the social script, if you will.
So it dictates whether you show sorrow dramatically in public or wear certain colors like black or white in different cultures?
Or, conversely, it might dictate a kind of stoicism, a containment that values privacy over public display. It's meant to give that internal, often chaotic experience of grief a necessary, legitimizing, and structured external outlet.
And this is where the analysis gets interesting, looking at modern life.
This is where it gets particularly acute, yeah. What's fascinating, and frankly concerning, is what happens when these three definitions, grief, bereavement, mourning, collide in contemporary Western societies. We see what sociologists and thanatologists call the deritualization of mourning.
The deritualization conflict. Okay, tell us more about that. What exactly is lost when those rituals fade away?
Well, historically, think about rituals like set periods for people visiting, or wearing specific armbands, or the detailed practices in certain faiths, like the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva.
Right. Those provided clear roles and expectations.
Exactly. They were the public scaffolding for mourning. They gave the bereaved clear instructions, validation, and importantly, often time off from normal life. They essentially mandated public recognition and support.
But as modern societies, often more secular, prioritize things like individual privacy or efficiency, getting back to work quickly.
Precisely. Those socially sanctioned public mourning rituals have diminished significantly. They feel awkward or outdated or maybe just inefficient in our fast-paced world.
So the implication is individuals are experiencing profound, maybe debilitating internal. But the social infrastructure, those external scripts of mourning, they're either really vague or just missing.
That's exactly it. And the cost of this privatization of grief is profound. When you lack validated external mechanisms to process and share the loss, the bereaved are often forced into isolation.
Like they're expected to just get over it quickly and quietly.
Yeah, process this massive life-altering event silently, largely alone. And this social invalidation, this lack of a script, it actually complicates the internal process. It increases the risk of prolonged or complicated grief outcomes because that necessary social outlet, that validation is denied.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive really shows us something critical. Grief is truly a whole person experience. The idea that it's just being sad is such a dramatic oversimplification, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It impacts every facet of your being, emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral. It's so much more than sadness.
Let's break that down, the emotional landscape first. It's complex, contradictory even.
Far more complex than just sadness, yes. It's a whole spectrum, often overwhelming and confusing. Right in the immediate aftermath, for instance, we often see intense shock and numbness.
Like a protective layer.
Exactly. It acts as an essential psychological buffer. It's a natural defense mechanism that kind of protects the individual from having to process the full, crushing emotional reality all at once. It's like psychic padding.
But once that initial shield starts to fade, the complexity really kicks in. Like anger, which you mentioned people find surprising.
Incredibly common and, often surprising and even guilt-inducing for the griever. But it's a natural explosion of profound pain and fundamentally helplessness.
And it can be directed anywhere, right? At doctors, a higher power, the universe?
Even at the person who died, paradoxically, for having abandoned them.
Yeah.
Or at oneself. It's the mind basically raging against a reality it cannot control or change.
Then there's the pervasive guilt and blame, the what-ifs.
The what-ifs and if-onlys. The mind just ruminates relentlessly over scenarios, things said or left unsaid, perceived failures. If only I'd called them that morning. If only I'd noticed sooner.
It sounds like a cognitive attempt to regain some control. Like, if I can find how I was responsible, maybe I can prevent future loss.
That's often the underlying mechanism, yes. But that rumination, while understandable, can become incredibly destructive and self-punishing.
And what about the sheer physical feeling of anxiety? Loss just shatters your fundamental sense of safety, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Predictability goes out the window. So Intense anxiety and fear become incredibly prevalent. We're talking potential panic attacks, severe apprehension about the future, profound fears about simply coping alone.
Like, how will I manage? How will I survive this?
Exactly. And often there's a surge in existential dread, too, suddenly confronting your own mortality because you've seen how fragile life is. That terror often expresses itself physically.
And maybe the most complicated emotion, the one that often brings shame, is relief.
Ah, relief. It's highly natural, especially, as you might imagine, following a prolonged painful illness where the loved one suffered greatly.
Or where the caregiver burden was just immense, exhausting.
Absolutely. The relief that the suffering has finally ended for them and perhaps for you, or that the intense daily demands have lessened, it's a genuine, understandable human response.
But because society often expects only pure sorrow.
Exactly. That relief frequently transforms into a significant source of guilt itself. People feel ashamed for feeling it, which just complicates the emotional landscape even further. It's another layer of pain.
Okay, now let's shift to the body's response, the actual physiology of loss. The sources are clear. We have to view grief as a public health concern, not just an emotional state.
Definitely. When a person experiences intense grief, it is one of the most significant psychosocial stressors the body can possibly endure. And this stress triggers a whole cascade of physiological effects.
Starting with the immune system.
Yes, one of the most immediate effects we see is immune suppression. The sheer exhaustion and the chronic stress deplete the body's resources. This leaves the bereaved highly susceptible to minor illnesses, catching every cold that goes around, persistent infections. They are quite literally run down.
And beyond just catching things, how does that acute stress show up day to day physically?
We see a really wide array of quite severe somatic symptoms. Listeners might recognize this. Chronic, unrelenting fatigue that no amount of rest seems to fix.
Bone tired, yeah.
Exactly. Tension headaches are very common. A literal heavy ache or tightness in the chest. The feeling of a broken heart can be physical. Shortness of breath. Profound muscle aches, like the body is physically carrying the weight of the loss.
Digestive issues too.
Extremely common: nausea, diarrhea, constipation, because the nervous system is so dysregulated. And sometimes heightened sensitivity to noise or light. The whole system is just on edge.
And the disruption to basic biological functions. Sleep and diet seem to go haywire for many people.
Absolutely. That's regulatory disruption. It manifests often as debilitating insomnia or real difficulty falling asleep, or waking frequently in the very early hours, unable to get back to sleep.
Or the opposite, sleeping all the time.
Or, conversely, excessive sleeping, hypersomnia. But it's that kind of sleep that provides no feeling of actual rest. You wake up still exhausted.
And appetite.
Likewise, appetite often shifts dramatically. Significant loss of appetite leading to weight loss is common. But sometimes it's the opposite, overeating. Maybe seeking comfort in food as a way to self-soothe.
Now, this raises a really important question, and it demands a deeper explanation. What's the biological mechanism here? Why are these symptoms so real? It's not just in your head, is it?
Absolutely not. The mechanism is primarily the stress hormone axis, the HPA axis. The intense chronic stress of bereavement triggers the persistent release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
Okay, so your body is basically stuck in fight or flight mode.
For a prolonged period, yes. And this prolonged elevation of these hormones leads to a state of heightened and prolonged systemic inflammation throughout the entire body.
Inflammation, we usually think of that with like a sprained ankle. How does it connect to grief?
Well, think of systemic inflammation as the body's internal alarm system constantly blaring. It's not localized like an injury, it's body-wide. This state is linked to increased cellular damage over time.
So this inflammatory response is the direct, observable link between the emotional pain and actual physical illness.
It's a key pathway, yes. And it's linked not just to those immediate symptoms we discussed, fatigue, pain, brain fog, but significantly, it's linked to increased long-term health risks.
Like serious conditions.
Our sources confirm studies showing increased incidence of serious health outcomes down the line. This includes cardiovascular events, the so-called broken heart syndrome. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is a real stress-induced heart condition. And there's also evidence linking chronic inflammation from prolonged grief to elevated cancer risk in the long term. The pain is absolutely manifesting physiologically.
Wow, okay. And beyond the body and emotions, the mind itself is profoundly affected. It leads to a kind of temporary cognitive disability almost.
We often call this cognitive impairment, or more informally, grief brain or widow fog. People report severe disbelief, like this can't be real, a pervasive sense of confusion.
Difficulty concentrating.
Great difficulty concentrating, even on simple everyday tasks. And serious memory problems, forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations. That mental fog or fuzzy thinking is extremely common.
Which must make daily functioning, especially complex things like work or dealing with finances after a loss, incredibly hard.
Nearly impossible sometimes. The mind is just constantly preoccupied, running intrusive thoughts, memories, images of the deceased, or replaying the circumstances of the loss. There's very little bandwidth left for anything else.
And behaviorally, this often shows up as social withdrawal, maybe losing interest in hobbies.
Yes. Pulling back from social connections, loss of interest in activities that used to bring pleasure, that's very common. Sometimes also restlessness or agitation, like you can't sit still.
And what about those strange moments, the searching behaviors?
Ah, yes. The searching behaviors. This is when, maybe for a split second, you catch a glimpse of someone in a crowd who looks like the person who died.
Or you think you hear their voice, or expect them to walk through the door at the usual time.
Exactly. This is a manifestation of that intense yearning for the lost person. It's a profound biological drive, really, linked to Bowlby's work on attachment theory. It's the brain still instinctively scanning the environment for that missing attachment figure. It can feel quite startling when it happens.
And sadly, just as a warning, our sources note that sometimes the pain is just so overwhelming.
That individuals might turn to health-compromising behaviors? Yes. Increased substance use, alcohol, prescription, or non-prescription drugs, often as a misguided, desperate attempt to numb the severity of the psychological and the physical pain.
Which, of course, just creates a whole separate layer of problems and complicates healing even further.
Absolutely. It's a maladaptive coping strategy that can lead to dependency and other serious issues.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really interesting. We need to understand how experts have tried to model this whole process over time. Because the shift in thinking, moving away from rigid passive stages towards more dynamic active coping, that feels like the most crucial theoretical change for anyone trying to navigate loss today.
I agree completely. That evolution is key. We should probably start with the foundational ideas. The first really influential concept came from Sigmund Freud way back in the early 20th century. He talked about grief work.
Grief work? What did he mean by that?
Well, his psychoanalytic idea was that the main task of mourning was this painful withdrawal of emotional energy, what he called dekaphaxis, from the person who died.
So essentially, he framed the work as having to emotionally break that attachment bond.
Pretty much. So that the psychic energy, the libido, could be freed up and then reinvested in new relationships, new life tasks. It set a precedent, really. The goal was painful detachment, severing the tie.
Which sounds quite harsh now, actually.
It does, from our perspective. Then came John Bowlby, whose attachment theory in the mid-20th century really reframed the entire conversation in a fundamental way.
Bowlby linked it to our basic need for security.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bowlby argued that grief wasn't just some abstract psychoanalytic work. It was profound separation anxiety. He linked the reaction directly to our biological evolutionary need for security and proximity to our attachment figures.
So less about detaching, more about the distress of separation.
Precisely. And his model identified 4 rough phases, which feel more descriptive. First, that initial numbness and shock. Then, intense yearning and searching for the lost figure, those behaviors we just discussed. That often gives way to a period of disorganization and despair where things feel chaotic. And then finally, a stage of reorganization, finding a new way forward. Bowlby grounded grief not in intellectual tasks, but in our fundamental, deep-seated need for connection.
Okay, and now we arrive at the model that everyone seems to know, but which has maybe caused more confusion and self-doubt than any other. Kubler-Ross's stage model. DBDA, denial, anger, bargaining, depression acceptance.
Ah, yes. DBD. It's absolutely ubiquitous in popular culture. You see it everywhere. Yet critically, its widespread application to bereavement is rooted in a profound, fundamental error.
Wait, okay. If the Kubler-Ross stages are so popular, why does our source material critique them so heavily? What exactly did she study, and how did that get so incorrectly applied to grieving people?
That is the absolute core of the misunderstanding. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's incredibly important work, detailed in her 1969 book on death and dying, was based on extensive interviews with terminally ill patients, people facing their own impending mortality.
So she was describing the coping mechanisms of the dying person themselves, not their grieving family members.
Exactly. She was mapping their journey towards accepting their own death.
So the incredible irony is that this model was picked up, popularized, and incorrectly applied as this fixed, prescriptive, orderly roadmap for the surviving bereaved, even though it was never, ever intended for them.
That's precisely what happened. And this is where the comprehensive critique from modern thanatology really begins, because the flaws in applying it to bereavement are significant.
Okay, what are the main criticisms?
Well, first, there's a stark lack of empirical evidence. Decades of subsequent research trying to validate these stages in bereaved populations have consistently failed to prove that people actually grieve in these 5 discrete stages, or that they follow any specific predetermined sequence.
Real grief is just too messy and individual for that kind of roadmap.
Far too messy, too individual, too wave-like. The pathway just doesn't fit that neat linear model. Secondly, the model itself is conceptually, well, muddy.
How so?
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It's an incoherent mix of different psychological constructs. Denial and bargaining are more like cognitive coping mechanisms. Anger and depression are affective states, emotions. Acceptance is more a state of resolution or adaptation.
So it's mixing apples and oranges, theoretically speaking.
Exactly. It lacks conceptual coherence, which makes it theoretically unsound as a unified model of a process. And third, and this is perhaps the most serious criticism, is the very real potential for harm.
Harm? How can a descriptive model cause harm?
Because it's almost never presented descriptively. It's used prescriptively. If you apply data prescriptively, you are implicitly, sometimes explicitly, telling bereaved individuals that their intense, messy, unique, wave-like experience is somehow wrong if it doesn't fit the stages.
So people start to feel like they're grieving wrong, like they need to check off the boxes.
Precisely. If they skip the anger phase, they worry, am I stuck in denial? If they feel depressed for longer than the stage implies, they fear they're failing the process, not moving towards acceptance on schedule.
That must compound their distress terribly.
It does. And it leads to really misguided support attempts from friends or family who might say things like, well, shouldn't you be moving towards acceptance by now? Based on this flawed model.
Yeah.
It completely invalidates the person's current reality. Modern ontology firmly rejects the stage concept as any kind of prescriptive guide for the bereaved. It just doesn't fit.
Okay, so that strong critique is really what drove the development of these contemporary nonlinear perspectives. The big shift towards framing the griever not as a passive subject drifting through phases, but as an active agent in their own process.
Exactly. The focus shifted to what the bereaved person does. And a key early model here was J. William Worden's task model.
Tasks. Okay, so what did Worden say we need to do?
Worden argued that grieving requires actively completing certain tasks to adapt. He identified 4 main ones. Task 1 is accepting the reality of the loss, really letting it sink in that the person is gone and won't return.
That sounds like confronting denial, but as an action.
Yes. Task 2 is processing the pain of grief, allowing yourself to feel the complex emotions, not avoiding them. Task 3 is adjusting to a new environment without the deceased. This involves practical changes and taking on new roles.
Like figuring out finances or parenting alone.
Exactly. And Task 4 is about emotionally relocating the deceased, finding a way to maintain a connection through memory while still moving forward with your own life, reinvesting in life. The emphasis here is really on active psychological work, not just passively letting time pass.
That feels much more empowering, and perhaps the most influential non-linear model today, the one that seems to capture the lived experience for many, is the dual process model, DPM, by Margaret Strube and Hank Schutt.
Yes, the DPM is hugely influential and clinically very useful. It suggests grieving isn't a straight line at all, but a dynamic oscillation.
Oscillation, like swinging back and forth.
Exactly, like a pendulum swinging between 2 necessary orientations, 2 types of coping. On one side, you have loss-oriented coping.
That sounds like confronting the grief head-on.
It is. It involves doing the grief work, the crying, feeling the sadness, the yearning, maybe talking about the deceased, looking at photos, confronting the painful reality of the absence. It's intensely painful, absolutely necessary, but also incredibly exhausting.
Okay, so what's on the other side of the pendulum swing?
On the other side, you have restoration-oriented coping. This is the more practical work of adaptation. It means addressing the secondary stressors and the demands of life that arise because of the loss.
Like learning new skills, managing finances alone, maybe finding new social roles or activities, rebuilding your identity.
Precisely. Taking on new responsibilities, dealing with practical life changes. And the DPM posits that healthy grieving involves the ability to oscillate flexibly between these 2 poles.
So you confront the painful loss for a time, loss-oriented.
Yes, you engage with the pain.
But then you need to take a break almost by engaging in those restoration activities, handling life's demands, maybe even allowing yourself moments of distraction or joy.
Exactly. The goal is to avoid getting stuck too long in either extreme. You don't suppress the pain entirely by only focusing on restoration, but you also don't stay immersed in the raw grief so deeply and constantly that you fail to adapt and rebuild your life. It's a dynamic balance.
That makes so much sense intuitively. And this leads beautifully into the continuing bonds theory, which feels like it completely overturns Freud's original idea about needing to sever the relationship.
It absolutely does. Continuing bonds theory, developed by researchers like Dennis Klass, posits that the goal is not detachment or severing the bond at all, but rather transformation of the bond.
So the relationship isn't ended or discarded, it just changes form.
Precisely. It moves from one of physical presence to one of memory, internal connection, ritual, and inner dialogue. Maintaining an ongoing, evolving connection with the deceased, thinking about them, talking to them internally, celebrating their memory, feeling their guidance or presence is seen as normal, healthy, and adaptive.
Especially, I imagine, for losses like the death of a child, where severing the bond feels unthinkable.
Absolutely. It acknowledges that love doesn't end with death, and that maintaining that connection can be a vital source of comfort and meaning.
And finally, there's the meaning reconstruction model, championed by Robert Niemeyer, which really taps into the existential crisis that loss can trigger.
Yes, Niemeyer argues that grief is, at its core, a crisis of meaning. A significant loss, especially if someone's central to your life, doesn't just remove that person. It shatters your assumptions about the world, your sense of predictability, your life narrative.
You lose not just the person, but the future you imagined with them, and maybe even the version of yourself you were in that relationship.
Exactly. Your whole worldview can feel ruptured. Therefore, the core task of grief, in this model, is meaning reconstruction. It's about actively revising your life story, updating your self-identity, and finding or creating a new sense of meaning and purpose in a world that now incorporates this absence.
Can you give us a concrete example of what that reconstruction might look like?
Sure. It might involve someone shifting their narrative from, say, my life is over because my partner died, to something like, my life is irrevocably changed, but I can honor my partner's memory by pursuing this passion we shared, or my experience of loss gives me a unique ability to help others facing similar challenges.
So it's about finding a way to make sense of the nonsensical, to find coherence and purpose again.
It is. It's an active, effortful process of rebuilding a worldview that can accommodate the reality of the loss, while still allowing for continued life and growth. This active construction of meaning is seen as vital for long-term adaptation and well-being.
Okay, so we've explored the internal feelings, the symptoms, and how theories about the journey have evolved. Now we need to tackle a really crucial clinical question. When does that intense pain cross a line? When does it move from being normal, albeit incredibly debilitating, grief into something that requires professional clinical attention? We need to clarify those sometimes blurry boundaries.
This differentiation is arguably one of the most challenging areas in clinical practice in mental health, because on the surface, grief and major depressive disorder, MDD, share a lot of overlapping symptoms: intense sadness, loss of interest, changes in sleep, appetite.
Right, they can look very similar, especially in the early days.
They can. But they are fundamentally different constructs. Grief is, as we've said, a natural response to a specific loss. MDD is a pervasive clinical illness, a mood disorder that can certainly be triggered by loss, but has its own distinct features, prognosis, and treatment needs.
Okay, let's break down those key distinctions for our listener, maybe starting with the pattern of the emotions.
That's a great place to start. In what we'd call typical grief, those painful emotions, sadness, anger, guilt, tend to come in intense waves. They often get triggered by reminders of the deceased or the loss.
But crucially, there are breaks.
Yes, crucially, these waves are usually interspersed with periods, even if they're brief, of more neutral mood or even positive memories, warmth, or moments of connection with others. The pain is intense, but often tied to thoughts of the lost person.
And how does that contrast with MDD?
In MDD, the low mood, the sadness, and particularly the anhedonia, that pervasive inability to experience pleasure in anything, tend to be much more persistent, more pervasive. It colors everything. And it's often disconnected from specific thoughts of the loss. It's just a heavy, inescapable blanket of low mood or numbness.
Okay, that's a key difference. What about self-esteem? Our sources stress that difference.
Absolutely vital. In typical grief, core self-esteem is usually preserved. A grieving person generally understands they are suffering because a terrible external event happened to them. They usually maintain a basic sense of their own worth, even amidst the pain.
Whereas in depression,
MDD, conversely, often involves corrosive feelings of worthlessness, intense self-loathing, excessive or inappropriate guilt that's often unrelated to the specifics of the loss, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness about oneself and the future. These are hallmark symptoms of the depressive disorder itself, not typical grief.
and finally, the difficult topic of suicidal thoughts. How do those differ?
This requires very careful clinical assessment, but there's often a qualitative difference. In grief, thoughts of death, if they occur, are frequently centered around a desire to be reunited with the deceased, to join them, to end the intense pain of separation. It's often an attachment-related longing.
Whereas in MDD,
In MDD, suicidal ideation is more often linked to that global sense of hopelessness and worthlessness we just mentioned. It's tied to the feeling that life itself is inherently unbearable and meaningless, and that oneself is the problem, often independent of the specific loss. Distinguishing this is critical for assessing immediate risk and guiding intervention.
okay. This whole discussion about differentiation brings us directly to that controversial evolution in the diagnostic manual, the DSM. The previous version, DSM-IV, had something called the bereavement exclusion.
That's right. The bereavement exclusion, in essence, advised clinicians not to diagnose major depressive disorder in the first 2 months following a significant loss, even if the person technically met all the symptom criteria for depression during that time.
What was the thinking behind that exclusion?
The thinking was largely that acute grief often looks very much like depression, with those overlapping symptoms, but that it was a normal response that should be given time to resolve naturally without immediately labeling it as a mental disorder.
But the newer DSM-5 removed that exclusion. And that decision stirred up some debate, didn't it? Some people worried it would lead to pathologizing normal grieving.
It did cause some concern outside the clinical community, yes. But the rationale for removing it was primarily evidence-based and focused on clinical safety,
How so?
because bereavement is a known severe psychosocial stressor. And like any major stressor, it can precipitate a genuine, full-blown major depressive episode in individuals who are vulnerable. By rigidly adhering to the exclusion, clinicians risk overlooking and therefore undertreating severe depression that required immediate intervention.
Especially if the symptoms were particularly severe.
Exactly. Especially if the depressive symptoms included things like profound psychomotor retardation, slowing down, psychotic features, like delusions unrelated to the deceased, or those intense pervasive feelings of worthlessness that go beyond typical grief. The removal essentially acknowledges that grief and depression can, and sometimes do, coexist. It doesn't pathologize grief itself. Rather, it demands careful clinical differentiation and ensures that if MDD is present, even soon after a loss, it gets treated.
That precision, that ability to diagnose MDD even in bereavement, seems necessary for recognizing another distinct condition, prolonged grief disorder, or PGD.
Yes, the recognition of PGD as a distinct diagnosis in recent classifications like DSM-5-TR and ICD-11 is a major step. We now understand that for a minority of individuals, estimates vary, but maybe around 7 to 10% of bereaved people, the natural grieving process becomes severely dysregulated. It gets stuck.
So the acute symptoms just don't lessen with time.
They remain intensely debilitating. They prevent the person from adapting, from resuming necessary functioning in their lives, often for years. PGD is defined specifically as a loss-related disorder, distinct from both normal grief and MDD.
What are the specific key features that really differentiate PGD from normal, intense, ongoing grief? We know grief lasts, but what makes PGD different?
The distinguishing features are really the disabling intensity and the persistence over time without significant improvement. PGD involves intense, persistent yearning or longing for the deceased, and/or constant disabling preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased.
So it dominates their mental life.
Completely dominates it. And this is accompanied by extreme emotional pain related specifically to the separation. Intense sadness, guilt, anger, difficulty accepting the death, and significant identity disruption, feeling like a part of oneself died too. Crucially, the intensity of this specific grief profile does not significantly lessen over an extended period.
Is there a time criterion?
Yes. To meet the clinical duration criteria for PGD, these impairing symptoms must persist for at least 1 year after the loss in adults, or 6 months in children and adolescents, and cause significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning.
Okay, so to summarize this clinical piece, the clinical world now operates with a much more sophisticated tripartite understanding of what can happen after loss. There's normal, wave-like, ultimately adaptive grief, even if it's painful and long-lasting.
Correct.
Then there's the possibility of a loss precipitating a distinct major depressive disorder, which needs standard depression treatment.
Yes.
And then there's this specific, persistent, disabling condition of PGD, which requires its own specialized, grief-focused therapy.
Exactly. That precision allows for much more targeted and appropriate intervention, which is a huge advance over just lumping everything together.
Okay, so grief isn't this single monolithic thing. The context, the nature of the loss itself dramatically changes the entire experience, doesn't it? We often think of grief following a clear-cut death, but there are these profound forms of loss that really defy standard social scripts and create unique, often harder challenges.
Absolutely. The circumstances matter immensely. Let's start with one that happens before the death. Anticipatory grief.
This is the grieving that occurs before an expected loss, like when a loved one has a long terminal illness, maybe cancer or dementia.
Exactly. It's the process of mourning the incremental losses that happen along the way during the illness.
Mourning the loss of their health, their abilities, maybe shared activities you can't do anymore, the future plans you know won't happen.
All of that. And it's often coupled with the immense physical and emotional drain of being a caregiver during that time. You're grieving the person changing, even while they're still physically present.
Does anticipatory grief make the grief after the death easier? Does it prepare you?
You'd think it might. And it certainly offers a chance for preparation, for saying goodbyes, perhaps resolving conflicts. But the research is actually pretty inconclusive on whether it reliably lessens the intensity of the grief after the death occurs.
Really? Why not?
For many people, it seems it just stretches the grieving process out over years. And the actual death, when it finally comes, often brings its own acute wave of pain, sometimes mixed with that complicated relief we talked about. The emotional burden remains substantial, even if anticipated.
Okay. Next, a really vital concept, especially regarding isolation. Disenfranchised grief. This was coined by Kenneth Doko.
Yes, disenfranchised grief. It refers to grief that is not socially recognized, not publicly mourned, validated, or supported by society. The loss itself is somehow deemed illegitimate, or the relationship isn't recognized, or sometimes even the griever themselves isn't seen as entitled to grieve.
Can you give some examples? It sounds like hidden grief.
It often is hidden. Examples include the loss of an ex-spouse. People might think, why are you upset? You divorced years ago. Or the loss of a secret lover. The loss of deeply valued coworker, where the workplace doesn't acknowledge the depth of the connection.
Even the loss of a pet.
Definitely the loss of a pet, which for many people, especially those living alone, can be like losing a family member, yet society often minimizes it. Or losses that are stigmatized, like death by suicide or overdoses, where shame and silence can prevent open mourning.
So why does society deny people the right to mourn in these cases? Is it shame, awkwardness, lack of formal ties? And how does that denial multiply the isolation?
It's often a combination of those things. Shame, awkwardness, a lack of clear social scripts for non-traditional relationships, or stigmatized deaths. The lack of legal or formal ties, like with a pet or coworker, means there's no mandated time off work, no established funeral rituals.
And the griever might be met with dismissive comments.
Exactly. Remarks like, it was just a dog, or awkward silence. The outcome is profound isolation. Because the loss isn't validated, the bereaved person is denied access to the very social support and the mourning rituals that we know facilitate healthy grieving. It forces the grief underground and intensifies the internal process, making it much harder to integrate.
Wow, okay. And then there's the concept that really captures the torment of uncertainty. Ambiguous loss, developed by Pauline Boss. This is loss that's unclear, uncertain, lacks finality.
Yes, it lacks that psychological closure, which freezes the grieving process because the mind simply cannot transition from hoping or wondering into actual mourning. You don't know what to mourn, or if you even should be mourning yet.
Boss defined two distinct types, didn't she?
She did. Type 1 ambiguous loss is goodbye without leaving. This is when the person is physically present, but psychologically absent.
Like with severe Alzheimer's or dementia, or someone lost to addiction, or maybe severe mental illness, or even estrangement.
Exactly those situations. The physical body is there, which prevents final mourning. But the person you knew, the relationship as it was defined, is essentially gone. It creates this immense ongoing stress for the family, having to hold these two contradictory realities simultaneously. They're here, but they're not here.
And type 2 is the inverse.
Type 2 is leaving without a goodbye. Here, the person is physically absent but psychologically present because their fate is unknown.
So cases like missing persons, soldiers missing in action, kidnapping victims, people lost in natural disasters whose bodies aren't recovered.
Precisely. Because the ultimate fate is unknown, the bereaved family often cannot fully accept the reality of the death. That slim, agonizing possibility of their return might remain open, sometimes for years or decades, preventing the necessary cognitive step of accepting the loss and beginning the adaptation process. Hope keeps grief frozen.
So if we connect these types back to the bigger picture, it seems like the knowability and the social legitimacy of a loss are absolutely critical variables for healing.
They really are. Uncertainty and social invalidation directly obstruct those core healing mechanisms we discussed. If the loss is ambiguous, the cognitive certainty needed to accept reality and begin mourning is just absent. You're stuck in limbo.
And if the loss is disenfranchised, the social permission to mourn, the access to support and ritual is withheld.
Exactly. In both cases, the fundamental functions of social support and shared ritual, which help structure and validate the grief, are disrupted or denied, significantly increasing the risk of complicated, prolonged outcomes.
Finally, let's acknowledge collective grief. This is the shared sorrow felt by a whole community or a nation or even globally.
Yes, we've certainly seen this intensely in recent years with the COVID-19 pandemic, not just mourning the staggering loss of life, but also the collective loss of normalcy, security, connection.
And it gets triggered by major tragedies too, like 9/11 or natural disasters, or maybe the death of widely beloved public figures.
Absolutely. Think of the outpouring after Princess Diana's death, for example. Collective grief and the public rituals that often accompany it, memorials, moments of silence, shared narratives, can serve a profound social function.
Creating solidarity, community healing.
Yes, generating solidarity, offering a sense of shared experience and mutual support in the face of large-scale trauma or loss. However, it's important to remember that even within a collective grief experience, the grief remains deeply personal for each individual.
And these public events can act as triggers too.
Definitely. They often reawaken feelings related to people's own private, past, maybe unresolved losses. The public sorrow resonates with and can amplify personal sorrow.
Okay, so if grief is like a fingerprint, then no two prints are ever exactly alike. Modern theory really emphasizes this: no two people experience loss in precisely the same way, even if they're grieving the very same person. So what are the unique variables that actually compose your individual grief print?
That's a great analogy. We have to look at several interacting categories of factors. First are the relational and circumstantial factors. Probably the single most significant predictor of grief intensity and duration is the nature of the relationship itself.
Meaning its depth, how long it lasted, how central that person was to the survivor's identity and daily life.
Exactly. The loss of a child, for instance, is statistically correlated with some of the most intense, complex, and long-lasting grief reactions. The loss of a long-term spouse who is your primary confidant is different from losing a distant relative.
And the complexity or quality of the relationship matters hugely too, right? It's not just about closeness.
Absolutely. If the relationship was highly ambivalent, perhaps marked by intense conflict or even abuse, the grief can become profoundly complicated.
How so?
The bereaved person might struggle with intense anger towards the deceased, unresolved guilt over things left unsaid or undone, or perhaps feel relief alongside the sadness. And then they might feel intense shame about feeling relieved or angry, creating this difficult, tangled emotional knot that's hard to unravel.
Okay, then there are the circumstances of the death itself, how the person died.
Yes, this is critical. Was the death sudden, violent, or traumatic? Things like accidents, homicide, suicide, these introduce elements of shock, horror, maybe intense violation.
Which might lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Often, yes. PTSD symptoms can overlay the grief, severely complicating the process. Trauma-focused therapy might actually be needed before the person can even begin to engage with the grief work itself.
And what about an anticipated death after a long illness?
An anticipated death might allow for some of that preparatory grief we discussed, maybe saying goodbyes, but it often carries its own heavy baggage, months or years of caregiver exhaustion, the trauma of witnessing prolonged suffering, perhaps financial strain from the illness. So anticipated doesn't necessarily mean easier.
Okay, moving from the external circumstances to the internal world of the griever. A person's basic personality and coping style must play a massive role.
Huge role. Are they generally resilient, optimistic, or do they have a tendency towards anxiety, worry, rumination? How do they typically handle stress? Someone who tends towards active problem-solving coping will likely navigate grief differently than someone whose primary coping mechanism is avoidance, denial, or emotional withdrawal.
And the age and developmental stage of the bereaved person is another critical lens, isn't it? Grief looks different in a child versus an adult.
Very different. For children, their understanding of death itself changes as they grow. A 3-year-old's grasp of permanence is vastly different from a 10-year-old's. So children often have to re-grieve the same loss at different developmental stages as their comprehension deepens.
And adolescence.
Adolescents are grappling with loss while simultaneously navigating intense identity formation, peer relationships, separation from parents. It's a uniquely challenging time. And older adults often face what we call compounded loss.
Meaning multiple losses piling up.
Yes. The death of a spouse might coincide with their own declining health, loss of mobility, retirement from work, and the deaths of friends within their social network. Each loss compounds the others, shrinking their world.
And, of course, the person's baseline mental health history before the loss is critical.
Absolutely crucial. Prior losses and mental health status act as either protective factors or significant vulnerability factors. Unresolved grief from past losses is almost always reawakened and compounded by a current bereavement. It's like old wounds get torn open again.
And pre-existing conditions.
Pre-existing conditions like depression, anxiety disorders, or substance use disorders significantly increase the vulnerability to developing complicated grief, or PGD, or a major depressive episode following a new major loss. Their coping resources may already be depleted.
Okay, finally, the sociocultural context of world around the griever. This acts as either a protective buffer or, sadly, sometimes a source of additional harm.
Yes, the quality and, importantly, the availability of social support systems are among the most critical protective factors identified in research. Feeling understood, supported, and cared for makes a huge difference.
Conversely, feeling isolated, misunderstood, or judged significantly exacerbates distress and complicates outcomes.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to note the quality of the support matters. Well-intentioned but prescriptive support, being told what you should do, how you should feel, when you should move on, can actually be more harmful than no support at all because it's invalidating.
Just listening without judgment seems key.
Listening, validating, offering practical help without taking over, those are often the most helpful things. You touched on it earlier, but the role of cultural and religious beliefs cannot be overstated in shaping the experience.
Because they provide essential frameworks for meaning-making.
Exactly. Whether it's the structure provided by a wake or a Shiva period, specific mourning rituals like wearing certain clothes, or a theological belief system that offers explanations about death and an afterlife, these frameworks help structure the chaos of loss. They validate the pain, offer sanctioned channels for expressing it, and connect the individual to a community and a tradition.
And in more secular or mobile societies where those frameworks might be weaker or absent.
The individual is often left to navigate the complex existential questions and the intense emotions more solitarily, which can be much harder.
So the synthesis here really confirms what we've been discussing all along. Grief is this emergent property. It's the unique result of the complex interaction of all these different systems, the relationship, the circumstances, the person's internal world, the social context.
Precisely. Which confirms exactly why any rigid one-size-fits-all approach to grief or grief support is fundamentally inadequate and potentially harmful. True support has to be radically personalized to the individual's unique fingerprint of loss.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Now, let's try to provide the ultimate shortcut, maybe, to being well-informed about grief by actively dismantling some of the most harmful, pervasive myths that our society continues to perpetuate about loss. These myths create such unrealistic expectations, and they really invalidate the unique experience of bereaved people.
This is so important because these myths are everywhere and they cause real pain. The first, and possibly the most damaging one, often inflicted by well-meaning but frankly ignorant people, is the timeline fallacy.
Ah, yes, the myth that grief follows some kind of predictable schedule, that you should be over it or back to normal within, say, 6 months or definitely by a year.
Exactly that myth. The reality, supported by all credible research and clinical experience, is that there is no universal timetable for grief. It simply doesn't respect deadlines or calendars.
So while the really acute, intense phase might lessen for many people over the first year or maybe 18 months,
Yes, the intensity generally shifts, but the process of adaptation, of integration, of learning to live with the absence that unfolds over a lifetime, the notion of a set duration after which you should be done, is a harmful fiction. It forces bereaved people to feel ashamed if they're still struggling, to prematurely suppress their emotions just to make others feel more comfortable.
And the sources give a great term for those inevitable times when the pain surges back, even years later.
Yes, those moments when grief resurfaces with surprising intensity, often ambushing you, triggered by holidays, anniversaries, birthdays, or maybe just a specific sensory reminder, a particular song, a smell, seeing someone who looks similar. These are known clinically as sudden temporary upsurges of grief, or STUGs.
The Stugs, that's such a helpful term. I think anyone listening who has experienced significant loss recognizes that sudden wave. It's like your body and your heart react instantly, sometimes before your mind even catches up.
Exactly. You might smell a specific cologne they wore or hear a particular turn of phrase, and boom, the grief is right there, fresh and raw for a moment. STUGs are normal. They are adaptive in a way, reminders of the bond, and they absolutely do not mean you're failing to heal or going backwards. It's the continuing bond asserting itself.
So important to normalize that.
And the passive misconception tied to this timeline myth is that time alone heals all wounds. The reality is that time itself is passive. It just passes. It's active engagement with the grief, with adapting to the changed world that oscillation, the dual process model, talks about, that facilitates integration and healing, not just waiting.
Okay, next up, the ubiquitous and really unhelpful closure fallacy.
Closure. The myth is that the entire goal, the end point of grieving, is to reach this neat destination called closure, and by doing so, you get over the loss, as if it's a chapter in a book that you can just firmly shut, file away, and maybe never think about again.
It always sounds more like a business deal or a legal contract, reaching closure, not a profound human emotional experience.
It really does. And contemporary grief experts firmly reject closure as an unrealistic, unhelpful, and frankly emotionally damaging goal. It implies the loss is somehow discarded, forgotten, put behind you completely.
So what's the more compassionate and realistic goal then?
The goal is integration. You don't get over a significant loss in the sense of leaving it behind. You learn to integrate the reality of the absence into your ongoing life, into your identity. The relationship with the person isn't ended. It's transformed into one of memory, enduring connection, internal presence, and legacy.
So the aim isn't to somehow return to the person you were before the loss.
No, that person doesn't exist anymore. The aim is to integrate the reality of the absence into a newly reconstructed identity and find a way to carry the loss forward in a meaningful way as you continue to live.
That feels much more respectful to the significance of the loss. Okay, finally, let's tackle the emotional expression fallacies, which often lead to profound invalidation for people. Myth A, you must cry, and cry intensely. A lack of tears means you don't really care, or you must be in denial.
Oh, this is a terrible one. Reality. Crying is common, it's healthy, it's a natural release for many people, but it is absolutely not a prerequisite for experiencing deep pain or profound grief. People grieve in highly individualized ways.
Some people process more cognitively or through action.
Exactly. Some people process loss primarily cognitively. They might need to understand every detail of the death, research it relentlessly, journal extensively. Others grieve more behaviorally through action, organizing memorial events, creating foundations, keeping busy with practical tasks related to the loss. Some feel it more physically in their bodies. Judging the depth or authenticity of a person's grief based solely on their outward display of tears is profoundly invalidating and entirely inaccurate.
And the related myth B, the flip side almost, that it's best to avoid the pain of grief by just being strong, keeping busy, or actively suppressing your emotions.
Right, the stiff upper lip approach.
Well,
While short-term distraction, taking breaks from the pain, is actually a healthy and necessary part of that oscillation we talked about with the dual process model.
You need those restoration periods.
You do. But using avoidance or suppression as a consistent long-term strategy is generally counterproductive. Denied or suppressed grief doesn't just vanish, it tends to fester. It can prolong the healing process, leak out in unexpected ways like irritability or physical symptoms, and potentially contribute to later psychological or physical complications.
So healing requires actually facing and actively working through the pain, at least some of the time.
Yes, it requires that courage to oscillate into the loss-oriented coping frequently enough to process the reality, feel the emotions, and gradually integrate the experience. Avoiding it indefinitely just keeps it unresolved. You know, when you look at the whole evolution of grief theory, from Freud's early ideas about needing to sever bonds, all the way through Bowlby, Kubler-Ross's critiques, and landing on these more dynamic fluid models like the dual process, continuing bonds, and meaning reconstruction, it shows this fundamental shift in our understanding. We've moved toward viewing grief not as some linear pathology to be cured, but as an active, fluid, often lifelong process of adaptation.
Necessary response, really.
A necessary natural response, rooted fundamentally in the enduring power of love and attachment. It requires the active reconstruction of a world that has been fundamentally changed by absence.
We've really tried to map the terrain today, identify the signs of both adaptive and potentially complicated journeys, and hopefully correct some of those historical mistakes and unhelpful myths about what grief is and what it isn't. We sincerely hope this deep dive provides you, our listener, with some clarity, maybe some validation that you need to navigate this journey, whether it's your own or if you're walking alongside someone else.
And just to reiterate that final point from our discussion on individual factors, remember that every factor we discussed, the nature of your relationship, the circumstances, the availability of social ritual and support, your own personality and coping style, your history, your developmental stage, all of these interact dynamically to create your unique system of grieving.
Your unique fingerprint.
Exactly. Which is why compassion, both through yourself and from others, has to be radically personalized. Support needs to try and match the individual's unique experience and needs, not impose some generic expectation.
And since we've talked so much about grief being fundamentally about reconstructing your life narrative after a rupture, maybe here's a final thought for you to consider as you move forward. How might truly validating and actively supporting the unique forms of ambiguous and disenfranchised grief, those losses that often go unseen or unacknowledged, how might that fundamentally change the way our society approaches collective healing?
That's a powerful question. If we collectively learn to give people the necessary social permission, the language, the rituals, to mourn losses that currently go hidden or unsupported, what wider possibilities for community connection, for empathy, for shared understanding might that unlock for all of us?
It's the strength to build anew. It's the light to guide you through. It's the choice to find your way. Starting here, starting today.
And that brings us to the end of our episode. My hope is that by diving into the science, we've started to dismantle some of the myths around grief, especially the idea that it's a simple, linear process you just have to get through. Join me next week for our next episode, Grief Reframed: Why Loss is an Active, Adaptive Process. We'll explore how grieving isn't just something that passively happens to you, but is actually an active process your brain and body use to adapt to a new reality. If you're finding this new season valuable, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And if you'd like to support the show, all the information for our donation link is in the show notes. As always, you can find all resources at yourjourneyyourtools.com and the app at yourjourneyyourtools.app. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you on your journey.